Okay, so thank you everyone for putting this on the agenda. This has been a long time in the making, this process. And a little bit of context is this was actually Chair Musella had suggested the possibility of potentially having a special education audit into some specific questions that we had around what our strengths and weaknesses or needs might be. And this survey was intended as a step to sort of springboard into that by basically getting more information, if I summarized it correctly. Did I miss anything? Yeah, so I wanted to say first that, whoops, I'm going off the one on the screen and not the one over here. A special thanks to our work group. So we've had a lot of meetings. We have the SEAC co-chairs, Matt and Diane. We've had several voting SEAC members. Dr. Hughes, the former director, was a part of that work. Chris behind us, our technical support for the survey, myself and school committee member Allison Powell. And I think that in addition, we've now debriefed with current leadership for special education. So what was the process? And I'm going to try to go kind of fast just because I know we have a busy agenda tonight. But the process was, first we had to meet and create the survey. This took several meetings. We had to review our past surveys. We had to think about areas we wanted, like what was the rationale? What areas did we want to target? We had to view samples, talk about how accessible the samples were to various parents. And then we designed and brought it back to SEAC for advising. From there, we had to disseminate the survey. We used every mode of dissemination possible in this district. Again, thank you to Mrs. Meyer, former superintendent, Dr. Hughes, our former director, building administrators, and school committee members who all helped with the dissemination. We have 176 responses. And given that our special education numbers are, I'm not exactly sure, I want to say in the 200, 250-ish range. I might be off a little bit there. I think that's a really great response rate. And then finally, we had to have meetings to analyze the results. There were several work group meetings. We started with overall strengths and weaknesses. We identified a few key questions, and then we decided we needed to look at the data broken down a little differently. So the survey itself is built around, remember that initial plan about how do we want to build the survey? It's built around two major premises. Half of the survey is about compliance, because as you all know, part of our role as school committee members is to make sure that we are following the law. And the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has, very specific principles that we need to be following. So, we have a good portion of the survey that's basically compliance, and we're asking parents and families, do we feel like we're compliant in these areas? But that's a minimum bar, right? So that's not where we stop. We have a district strategic plan that's a vision for something better. And that vision includes all students, all means all, that includes students with disabilities. So you're going to see that the survey does both. I keep skipping mine thinking that the one on the screen is going to move too. So moving into that, I know a lot of people are not familiar with special education language. Actually, it looks like the one on the screen skipped a slide. If you could just back up one more, Dr. Arnoff. Uh-oh. The one up there, I don't know why the one on the screen doesn't show it. I apologize. I will try to generally summarize it for you, but we have Special Ed Acronyms 101. FAPE is a free and appropriate education. In general, I tried to put on the slide layman's speak for what does that mean? That means every student with a disability has to have a free and appropriate education, ensuring that they can succeed in the general education curriculum and progress. And that has to be at no cost to the family. The next acronym is IEP, that's Individualized Education Program, and that is how we're going to accomplish FAPE in the least restrictive environment. And I made a point of bulleting two parts of the IEP. I'm going to have to open it in front of me so that I can see what I wrote, because I tried to really be thinking about how to make this accessible. The IEP has to have two parts. One has to enable the child to be included with non-disabled peers, which is the least restrictive environment. But the second part, which a lot of people don't realize, is it has to enable progress in the general education curriculum so as to the ability, the circumstances of that child's disability. Meaning, we don't use an IEP as a reason why lack of success in academics or in any other area like the IEP is an excuse for that. The IEP is supposed to enable success. Child find just means that public schools have to identify, locate, and evaluate any students that need IEPs or have disabilities and need supports. Least restrictive environment, again, is the requirement to educate children with with disabilities as much as possible with their non-disabled peers. And finally, specially designed instruction is special education. Again, at no cost to families, the instruction has to be in line with the IEP and meet the unique needs of the child with of the student with a disability. Okay, and by the way, all of that language came from the book, A School Board Member's Guide to Special Education, which everyone here has a copy of, with the exception of maybe Dr. Ricca. Okay, now Dr. Onoff, you can move on. Okay, so GLOWs. Let's start with the good news. We always have strengths. GLOWs we quantified as areas of our survey that showed approximately to 8 to 10 of families surveyed felt we were doing well in addressing. Okay, so let's move on to our GLOWs. Oops, and I'm not skipping this. You poor people here, I can't see anything. Okay, there we go. So, you know, I'll give you a moment to look at this, but generally speaking, the left-hand column of the table is, oops, nope, Dr. Onoff, it looks like we skipped a slide again there. It looks like
it's missing every other.
Yeah, it's missing every other, and I don't know why. Okay, is it okay if I keep talking even though the folks at home? Okay, so I think you can see it here. The school committee and the superintendent should have a copy, but the elementary GLOWs, generally speaking, you see a lot more GLOWs in elementary than secondary. And, you know, there's a little kind of quotation box that says, no, the SEAC parents said this jives with what we've anecdotally heard at SEAC, that we tend to meet these needs better in the elementary level. Elementary also has strong collaboration across staff, special education related service and general ed, with notable strengths in IEP implementation. And this is important because it reflects compliance with FAPE, right? We're in compliance. Another strength for elementary is being accepted and valued, that parents report their child is accepted and valued, which is important for compliance because it's least restrictive environment, but it's also part of our strategic plan that all children will be known and appreciated. So there are some pluses. The secondary GLOWs were independent job skills. 75% of parents reported that their students age 14 and older were getting some daily living and career preparation skills. And 70% said that the IEP academic accommodations were met.
And I would just interject, I believe this presentation is in the public packet, right, Ms. Cecily? So if there's anybody who's participating on Zoom, this presentation in its entirety, every page is available on the district website in the packet. Sorry.
No problem. On the next slide, which I think Dr. Onoff has, is we wondered if we would see different patterns if we did. So the last table was elementary, secondary, which anybody who knows schools knows elementary and secondary schools are very different. So that's one of the reasons why we disaggregated that way. But also we wondered if we did better by students with more mild disabilities that are included most of the day, or if we did better or worse or commensurate with our more complex students that spent, and we defined this as they spend more than 80% of their day in a special education setting, more restrictive setting. And so you can see here that we actually had some nice GLOWs in both sides. They were different. I think that the general education, less complex GLOWs had to do with providing the supports that were needed, which is odd because later on you'll see data that kind of seems to contradict that. But I think you'll notice it's certain grade levels, certain parts of our district that struggle more with that. And then for the more complex students, I'm very proud to say 82% said their child was accepted and valued within the non-disabled community, that their family feels choice and input with regards to services that meet their child's needs, which is in line with IDEA because a parent is an equal team member, and that the teachers work together. 75% reported the teachers work together. You know, in the little thought bubble to recognize that it's anecdotal, there was a theme that the parents seemed to say, like, oh, that happens for you, that doesn't happen for me. And like, we did notice that it seemed like when parents advocate, they may get different things than parents who don't advocate. And just generally speaking, they thought, how can we make these things universal so that, you know, any family whose child needs that gets it. Next slide is just a summary of kind of what we've covered in the GLOWs. Okay, it's not on that screen, but it's up here. Again, speaking, you know, just as like a summarizing statement, elementary had more GLOWs than secondary. Elementary had strong collaboration and notable strengths in IEP implementation, and that inclusion, being accepted and valued, is a strength.
Sorry, just one quick.
Sure.
What do you consider a glow over what percent of agree or whatever?
80% was what we were shooting for,
Mhm.
but you'll notice some of them are in the 70s because there weren't any 80% in that particular bucket.
Thank you.
Because 75 is pretty, and again, we acknowledge that even two parent families saying no, those two families matter, but it does mean that there is a relative strength there. We probably have some small pockets of need, but it's not necessarily a systemic issue.
Thanks.
Anybody have any questions about the glows or the survey or the why? It does seem like a
Can I ask this question? So this does not include 504?
no, and
doesn't
one of the
include
questions
English
you'll see
language
it say
learners, it
references 504. It
Yes.
didn't include 504, and the reason originally we wanted to do 504 is included, and the only reason that ended up happening was because in dissemination we were struggling with how we would be able to do that. We had more easily accessible ability to communicate with parents who have children with IEPs than we did with 504s. So I think in the future, I think that is something that we probably could expand, if that makes sense. So we were kind of on the fence about that, and it really ended up being a logistics challenge.
And again, I mean, this is great to have and all that, but also, I talk about this sometimes, so maybe I have it wrong, but there are 4 constituent groups within at-risk students.
Mhm.
IEPs, 504s, DCYFs, so children who are referred here, broken homes, the Department of Youth, Children, and Families, and then English language learners. And I always like to quote these figures. I use them with this legislature when we were fighting for funds, because when you add up those 4 different groups, it's about 25% of the total student body. And they're all at some level at risk. And so I think this is great. Just going forward, I would like to know more and to be as inclusive as possible with those other 3 student populations, because I think they're extremely important. And they require, different kinds of supports, but supports above and beyond as well. So just a
Yeah, 2 things I would say about that. One was I would also include students that are in, whether they call it RTI or MTSS, but and
Yes,
that is
it's bigger,
that is over 1/3 of our population. So like as in when you put all those groups together, that's 1/3.
yes.
So it's a very large group, but I would also add that the reason though that we focused on this group and or maybe 504 is there's actually extensive legal protections. So while we want to do what's right for kids, period, here has also that if we make mistakes, even inadvertently, it can quickly spiral into other issues, right? And when you make improvement plans that target this group, you don't do it just for these students. These students are in all of our settings. So if we identify a need, it's a need for all kids. And so if we address that need, we're going to help all kids. ELL, MTSS students, students with socioeconomic disadvantage, neglect. It's good for all students.
I think our council wanted
So-
to weigh
sorry.
in. Not at
Just
all.
one
No,
quick-
please.
One quick note, just to Nicole's point, I do think it's important that you separate out those groups and their needs, especially with the, if you want to call them ELLs, in Rhode Island, we call them multilingual learners now by regulation. But they are also a group that is highly regulated legally. But one of the ways that you can get into liability issues with MLLs is over identifying them in special education and not looking at their, needs as language needs, but instead as a disability. So it is really important legally when the district is doing surveys to make sure that they parse out those 2 groups and look at special education needs in one bucket and then language acquisition needs, as a multilingual learner in a second, very different bucket. Best practice for both groups is really best practice for all kids, but it is important legally to make that distinction, even when we're doing surveys, and because you can't get into legal issues with MLLs when you start grouping them together with special education students because their needs are very different.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Obviously, that wasn't my intention.
No, I didn't think that was your intention at all.
And I appreciate that. So I think that's really important.
Go ahead, Ms. Bucka, if you want to
And
continue.
philosophically, I don't consider any of that risk. They're just different. Multilingual learners need dual language programming. They need supports. It's not risk. So I would just, but regardless, I think that Now we move into our grows, and these were defined as, oops, I gotta make sure I can see. We defined the grows as, I'm trying to remember what percentage it was. The highest questions that had the highest percent of families that reported the negative. So disagree, strongly disagree. So these are the highest areas. So if we go to the next slide, our first grow is, and I'm trying to keep up on my own here, sorry. Families report getting their child's disability-based needs met through an IEP or 504 plan is an unclear and difficult process. And the reason this is important to us is that's child find. That's a fundamental part of IDEA. Now, why is that happening? Could be a lot of things. It might not be something that is out of compliance, but it's something we should think about. So if you go to the next slide, you can see the data. And it's broken down because I think it helped us to think about it a little differently. You see the all data across the top, which you had in your folder for today's meeting. And then it breaks down by elementary, secondary, students with that less complex profile where they spend up to 80% of their day in general education, or vice versa. I meant 60. Most of their day in general education versus most of their day with more restrictive settings. And you can see that it looks like where we start to struggle more, a little more, is less complex profiles in secondary. Now, you'll see in our recommendation, don't take anything I say as the reason for this. We should dig deeper, but it kind of makes sense that some disabilities that might arise, elementary, the students might do okay. You know, they're mild disabilities, they're not struggling so much, but as the secondary level gets more teachers, more complex thinking, more complex expectations, that students may start to struggle. And that this, I think, says that parents are saying at that point, I'm having trouble getting reconsideration of this matter. So if you go to the next slide, here is our recommendation. Our recommendation, oops, gotta remember to do it up here, okay, is that since Dr. Hughes had said that RIDE was willing to do a support visit earlier than originally planned to come in and do some sort of school support visit, we would recommend that maybe we ask RIDE, since this is a compliance part that RIDE does a lot with, that RIDE look at that and make sure that parents who have been through the process were included in that data set. So not just file reviews, but actually talking with the families. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next grow, let me move my slides here. Families report that services defined in the IEP, specifically social, emotional, and behavioral, are not consistently provided. If we go to the next slide. Again, you can see here a little bit of that pattern in the sense that, and by the way, I should have said this earlier, I apologize. Blue is somewhat or strongly disagree. And then you can see that there are, red is somewhat or strongly agree, and then neutral. So I'm paying a lot of attention right now to the blue because that's how we ranked our grows. It looks like secondary and actually secondary seems to be primarily our issue. And in the discussion, see the little anecdotal bubble? In our families discussion, we talked about high staff turnover. I think we're currently experiencing some school psychologist vacancies at the secondary level. Plus, we always had very few school psychologists and social workers for very large schools. They're pretty good sized schools. So we have concerns over adequacy of the personnel. It was just a theory to explore. Next slide. So and this next slide is, we asked ourselves in triangulating, right? This is just one data point. Are there any other existing data points that may either validate or refute this data point? This is our survey works data, family survey works data from 2022. And you can see that if you go down on the pink line, you can see where it says social emotional learning supports. And you can see as soon as it's a family responding for a student with an IEP, which is 137 families, we get -12, meaning as compared to the responses of other families, this one shows disproportionate negative impact. So I think that this was just another data point that said, I think parents are saying something here that we should think about. Next, so what is the recommendation? Our recommendation is that per policy 8515 special education staffing, we would like to see the director lead a special education, including related services staffing and caseload evaluation. So audit our staffing and our caseloads and demonstrate that, we've looked at this deeply and have some feedback to share with us, the school board, the school committee, the superintendent, with regards to personnel adequacy and our ability to be compliant with the IEPs. So that would be the first step. And I think it's fair to do that internally first, because it seems like a new director should be given the opportunity to do that. And then the second part would be, if we have an audit, have the data gathered by our director looked at by an objective outside person, just to give additional future recommendations. Okay, next slide. We're almost done. Need, the next grow is families report access to math curriculum and instruction is an issue district-wide K-12 for students with IEPs. So if we go to the next slide, which is the data, oops, back up. You can see that this is our largest, this is our number one strongly disagree item. And actually, this is one of the few items that even our more complex kiddos are reporting that math is not effectively giving their children what they need. And I think this is particularly concerning K-5, because we've had the same curriculum and visions, K-5, there's no new adoption. We've had that curriculum for a long time. People know how to use it, they've been trained. And so I think this is particularly concerning if we think about elementary school, because I think we should be doing that pretty decently. And then by secondary, at least we can say to ourselves, okay, we're adopting a new high quality curriculum and hopefully that will improve. And then the most complex kids, that's definitely something that we need to look at. Next slide, please. Again, data points, triangulating our data. You know, parents are reporting their children are not being successful in math. This is our last RICAS data. On the left-hand side, you can see students without IEPs math proficiency. And on the right-hand side, you can see students with IEPs math proficiency. So again, IEPs are supposed to ensure your access to the general education curriculum. And you know, this indicates a problem both for compliance as well as our vision and our strategic plan. Okay, so what do we recommend? Next slide. This is actually the area that we really said this needs an audit. Like this is the first area where we're like K-5, because of that existing curriculum and existing practices and no new programming, this really could use an audit. That we would like to know what it is that we need to do to be more accessible in our math curriculum and instruction K through 5. And again, you know, to Mr. Munoz's point earlier, when we do things better for students who learn differently, we actually improve what we do for all students. So, and I think that there are parents who feel we could probably improve in the math area. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this kind of continues with the same pattern, but it's not as dramatic as math. That families report that academics in general for students with IEPs is a concern, even as early as elementary. 1 in 5 families are concerned, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it only gets bigger as they move on. Next slide. You can see this data is not as dramatic as math, which is good. ELA, we are doing better. But even ELA, we adopted a new high quality curriculum in the lower elementary grade, you know, a couple of years ago, and now we're moving into the upper elementary. It's still concerning to see, say, 1 out of every 5 family feeling that their students not learning to read and getting foundational literacy skills. So the only reason, if you go to the next slide, we did not recommend an audit of, and RICAS, like with math, validates that the parents are not crazy. There's no disagreement. We are struggling here. And if we go on to the next, I don't know why we have 2 RICAS. Did we accidentally do that? Oh, this was by grade level. And the only reason I added this is because SEAC already had this data. And, you know, one of the things I like to show about the data is you can watch the same group of kids move from year to year, and you can see, oh, good growth. Oh, next year, not good growth. Like, that's not a student specific issue. That has to do with something that we can do better. And so again, I just want to validate that I think the parent and family feedback is probably accurate. The next slide is the recommendation. Oh, okay, no, never mind. It's not the recommendation. The next area is of challenge was that the parents say that the school doesn't necessarily provide the child's IEP goal instruction or specially designed instruction as documented on the IEP. And the reason that we put this in this section, I apologize that I forgot about it, is because if you have a child with a learning disability or any disability that affects reading, it becomes a reading goal, right? If you have a math struggle, it becomes a math goal. So that's how the IEP is supposed to enable your child to make progress in the general education setting, is because the IEP specially designed instruction is effective and closes the gaps. So you can see here in this data point that first of all, for compliance purposes, we never want to see a family saying that they don't think the IEP is followed, so that's a concern always, but you can see that we really seem to struggle more so. Look at elementary versus secondary. I would definitely want to know, specially designed instruction, what is happening in our secondary schools? What is the struggle with accomplishing that? And I'm sure our staff could tell us. And then it also looks like our less complex kiddos, so the ones who are in general education more of the day, seem to be struggling more getting their needs met than our more complex, which means we're doing a better job in our more restrictive settings. We're struggling a little bit more with our inclusive settings. Okay, sorry, next slide. Am I going up here? This is just another SurveyWorks data point, family survey 2022 that validates. I think you can see it's not super important other than it validates. It says, how well do you feel your child's individualized education program was implemented this year as compared to past? And this year was non-COVID. So you would think generally it would probably be better. But you can still see 9%, and 17% said either not well, super not well, or kind of midway. So again, I think it validates that this is likely a little bit of a concern. Next slide. Okay, so what do we recommend? With regards to ELA, the reason we're not recommending an audit is because the ELA curriculum adoption is now moving to the upper elementary school. So obviously any audit is going to say, well, implement your new high quality curriculum and then we can talk, right? So an audit at this time would likely not be helpful. We would put money in and really the staff would be trying to learn that. Now, an audit focusing on specially designed instruction in the secondary settings is recommended, meaning what are the barriers to designing instruction that meets our IEP goals in the secondary areas? Is it scheduling? Is it use of personnel? Is it understanding what that means? That would be our recommendation. So far our audit is math K-5, SDI, specially designed instruction in the secondary settings. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does success look like? Our parent and director and school committee group wanted to define what we think success looks like to be helpful to the committee. The next slide. Success looks like, and I referred to this book because this actually came from there. We were having a nice conversation about it. We would like to see all school committee members and upper level leadership tour our special needs programs. Now that you have some context of what our strengths and struggles are, you can very candidly talk with staff, ask them what they need to improve math instruction, ask them how they think specially designed instruction happens or doesn't happen. And you, when you make decisions up here, would have a really good understanding of what those programs look like. In addition, we would like to see special education lens and expertise in all major decisions, not just a voice at the table, but a decision-making influence in line with our all means all strategic plan. Our recent math curriculum adoption, given this data, is like an example of, we don't want that to be an afterthought or one voice. It should be a front and center, powerful influencer. Next slide. This brings up a question. It's a wondering. If you look at our, sort of organizational hierarchy, and I'm making some assumptions that could be wrong, but just try to bear with me. If I presume that I don't know if our superintendent has special education background, and often special education, superintendents, assistant supes, even principals, often rarely have special education background or training. So if we want this voice and this lens front and center on all major decisions, I think it's important to look at this hierarchy and look at where our director sits. And I think that it doesn't mean that isn't how your culture might function a little differently. Like, in other words, this chart might not be how we actually function, but I think it would be saying a lot symbolically if this chart were to elevate the importance of that position. Again, keeping in mind that when we do well by differently abled learners, we do better by all. Okay, next slide. Finally, we would like to see each school get their specific data set from this survey for their school improvement informing. We'd like to have their school improvement team use this data. We would love to see this data, even just a couple data indicators, be infused into our district's data dashboard. And generally speaking, the parents just said they simply want to see growth and improvement from survey to survey, because even if we're only addressing one issue at a time, issues are systematically addressed, starting with an audit and these key focus areas below. That is it. Questions? And that ended up going longer than I meant to, so my apologies.
Thank you so much. Thank you for compiling all of this and taking all this together. And of course, thanks to the working group.
Oh, and some of them
for
are
the
here, by
time.
the way, just so you know.
Terrific.
Raise your hands.
Well, I see Dr. Hughes is here. Sure, I've got us. Mr. Murray is here. He's raised his hand. Thank you. Just to say hi. Thank you. Shout out. Anne Marie Jerzak appears to be here on Zoom. So terrific. Great work, and thank you for your time. I think let's open it up to the committee for questions and comments. Mr. Murphy, hi.
Hi. So I remember a while back, Mr. Mercaccio mentioned in the meeting, it was a health and wellness subcommittee meeting, a while back, we talked about, peer modeling, student interaction. Is there any place for that in this type of, because, we talk all means all, and, but we're doing right by the IEP. Is there any vision for that? Or, and I know you're much more well versed in this than I am, but just describe, how we can, maybe the entire community can build in this manner. Is there any?
Well, are you asking specific to elements of the survey? Like, I mean, so for one, I would say in the survey, it's going to be reflected in, am I accepted and valued with non-disabled peers? It's going to be in IEP goal implementation, because there should be IEP goals, that there is social skills, which would entail maybe a peer model, a peer mentor. So the survey, I think, has a little bit of a limited lens into that,
Yeah.
but
So I'm asking you to step outside that a bit, and maybe that's not necessarily the whole focus of this, but do you have a sense of anything like that we're coming into play?
well, we should be doing that. I mean, that's I think, it's an evidence-based practice to have peer models. And usually in most schools, it's related service providers that do that, which is school psychologists, social workers, speech providers. And I think that what I think would be important for this committee to understand is, when you see psychologists with 2 buildings to serve and they're only in a building 2 days a week and they have caseloads that are very large, you are unlikely to see those kinds of current and modern and well done evidence-based practices. So, and that's part of the reason why this is so important, and I'm so appreciative to Chair Nusella for prompting and starting it, because it's rare to see a school committee focus on this population. And when you do, think about when your child is the mentor who's now been the social peer and has had their confidence boosted and they've helped this other child, and it only makes our whole community stronger. So for us to put a lens and a microscope on here, it's important.
Yeah.
But that would be a great question when you tour the special ed classrooms to ask the related service providers.
I will. No, thanks. And I know it's a bit outside the scope of that, but I just want to give you an opportunity to speak to that in the event you thought about it. So thank you.
And it definitely aligns with the strategic plan. All students will be known, valued, and genuinely, I'm not quoting the words perfectly, but, especially when you have a mild, moderate, kind of like an invisible disability that most of your peers might not know, but they might know your social skills are not where they should be. Instead, they might think, oh, you're weird, or I don't want to be your friend. Whereas if they were a peer mentor, now they've been taught how to be with you, you're getting better, and now a real relationship has formed. I mean, that is life-changing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge.
Or even the social skills could be there, but then the organizational skills or executive functioning might not be there. So you might not pick up on that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. And I just also want to take a step back, just to help frame this discussion. There's so much here, and yet it was distilled so well for us to receive. And I just really appreciate the specific recommendations, because you'll recall, as we entered and sort of contemplated this, it was, is there a need for a special education audit? If that is limited, that is expensive, we might not need a full audit. Let's see if we can identify areas of need. And so I appreciate the identification of what can be covered in a ride visit versus what we want to focus on and potentially an audit. So thank you. Just interjecting. Other comments, questions?
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment as a member of the working group. I just wanted to also give my thanks and appreciation to Ms. Baca. I mean, so many people did contribute But because this was sort of not quite a nebulous ask, but something we hadn't contemplated previously, trying to distill down all of the concerns, all of the potential needs, turn it into actual questions, just like actually execute a survey, distill responses to get from should we have the special ed audit to what you just presented was an incredible amount of time and thought and work on your part, all of the group, absolutely, but you've now turned it into something that is workable for this committee. And I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that and to say my personal thank you for that, because it's exactly, I think, what we were looking for and what was needed. So thank you so much for that.
Yes, Mr.
Thank you for giving leadership to this. It really is terrific. I don't have anything more to say other than this is awesome, and you're an asset on the school committee in so many ways, but this probably more than anything else. So thank you.
And I hope that you will all take up the new director on the tour. I just really think there's a reason why it's in that book, because I think it really gives faces and names, and it gives an understanding of these various settings. And I think the staff appreciate being talked to and being noticed. And I think that they'll enjoy it.
I do actually have a couple of questions and comments. They're more specific. When we talk about child find, and we've talked about this a little bit, the families who were invited to participate in the survey are families whose children are already receiving services. And that is something, when we talk about next steps, which is going to be, I guess I would recommend that you, with any members of the working group, get together with our superintendent, a director of student services, Ms. Baker, whatever, to put together and our council, of course, to put together an RFP, essentially, because we're going to look to engage somebody to perform an audit. But I guess, and then of course, as a school committee, we can certainly add to that, independent of that, outside of recommendations. My question is, what about, I've heard a lot, I don't know what a lot is because it's anecdotal, of families whose students are not currently receiving services, but they think that their students should be, and they're somehow missed because they feel that the process is too onerous. There's so much burden to push to get evaluations or whatever that process is. Can we look at that too through whether it's through audit or whether it's through the ride visit? I'd like us to think about the best way to capture that and the most efficient way to capture that.
Well, it might not have been super clear in the recommendation, but that's why the recommendation said it's not just a file review or a talk to staff.
Right.
We actually wanted families whose children had gone to evaluation consideration, even better if they were denied, because now we're going to get a sense for, was it just because, we agree that the survey A, it's going to be skewed more positively because they're people who have already gotten an IEP.
Right.
But B, we don't know the nature of the struggle. So is it just that the process itself is unclear?
Right.
Is it just that it doesn't seem right? Is it, we don't really know what that is. So you really have to ask some families. That's why we said, if we're going to ask RIDE to do it, we would really like families. And so the way it works in schools is anytime you suspect a disability, any staff member or family can request a special education evaluation referral. And when it goes to the referral team, they decide whether they think they suspect, and they're going to go on, or they decide, no, they don't suspect and they're not going to go on. But when they say no, there's supposed to be a reason. We do not suspect because X, Y, Z, and then the parent would know. So if we interviewed the parent, they would have a decent sense for is it just you didn't understand the process? You would have liked a flow chart, or is it something about the way it went down you didn't think was right? I just think we need more information, generally speaking.
Thank you.
But it's interesting that it's secondary and mild disabilities. I'm not sure I would have thought that. That's all.
Thank you. I just also, in developing the two special ed policies that we did, the special education and special education staffing, and you participated in that process even before you were on school committee, and we worked with SEAC. we really tried to put something in the policy about collecting data on a regular basis. And this seems to be a good start. And so, I mean, is the expectation that take the same survey, just to be able to compare data year after year to sort of check in, perhaps add. I mean, it seems like an excellent, at the very least, a beginning. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's how they defined the families. When I asked them what is success, they did say doing it recurrent,
Right.
because they spent so much time in just making it accessible, and there was a lot of time into just how do we word the questions,
Right.
what words do we not use, because parents are like, I don't know what that means. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be nice to validate that. Does it need to be every year? I mean, I defer, we could make it every couple, but
Right.
Recurringly.
For a good sort of apples to apples comparison. It's terrific. And then finally, just about the org chart and the Director of Student Services, what I see in the org chart, but because it has to be crammed on, sort of an 8.5 by 11 space or whatever it is, I see the Director of Student Services actually reports directly to the superintendent. So what would you recommend instead then?
I think that at this moment, and again, this is, I'm just going to say that, I'm obviously not an administrator in this district. I'm not a staff member in this district, but I take the open-ended feedback that we received, as well as my own experiences and anecdotal, to say that it doesn't feel, we're not seeing evidence that director, that role, that person who brings that lens is regularly informing decision-making that we are making on admin team or the superintendent level. And sometimes it's just, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know to go ask the director because you're not really sure. You don't know that you don't know that you don't know. So what I would be suggesting is more of a direct line from the director to the admin team and the assistant. If I'd be so bold, I think a director of special services in an all means all strategic plan is an equivalent to an assistant sup. That's an important role. How do you get to all means all without having knowledge of special populations deeply embedded in your admin team? I mean, that would be my question. But again, organizational charts are not necessarily how you function, but I definitely think, especially by the time we get to secondary, where the principals no longer serve on the IEP teams, like the elementary, I feel like they're a little bit deeper knowledgeable about the kids because they're there as the LEA. But by the time we get to secondary, there's a real disconnect. And I don't know how to bridge that, but that would be a suggestion I would have.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Ms. Becca? I would actually just open it up for public comment and question if anybody who's here in person or on Zoom. I do see, first we see Matt Murray. So Dr. Arnoff, would you please promote him? And then we have a member of the public here. Welcome, Mr. Murray.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. And Mr. Murray is the current co-chair of SEAC. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And Nicole, thank you so much for your work on this. Allison for being in the working group, and Anne for sort of leading, the entire focus, from a school committee level, I think. And, I'll be brief because I know you're over time. I just want to say that this really targeted, I think, everything that we've heard in meetings anecdotally. So I know, Nicole presented the numbers, but this really did encapsulate so many of the things that we hear from parents. And I think everybody knows that the starting of data capture is a little scary, right? Are you going to get responses? Or how's it going to come out? Are there going to be actionable items in the report? And, I have to say from my view, all of those things have happened really well. And, what we're going to see now is if we take a methodical approach and keep going with this, you're going to see data move from column to column and get better and better. And I think the whole community will be proud of the effort. So anyway, thank you very much. And thank you for everybody for all the attention on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. And thank you, of course, for your time on all things SEAC and everything else. Thank you. Would you like to, if you don't mind, coming to the podium again? Thank you. Sorry. So that people at Zoom in Zoom land can hear as well. Thank you. Ms.
Yeah,
Molina.
sure. Just a quick clarifying question. That was really helpful data and information, so I really appreciate you presenting that. I'm wondering in the survey whether you identified families who initiated the request for an IEP or had a social service agency or child welfare agency requesting the IEP versus the school has proactively identified a need and has requested the family's attention.
We did not.
Okay.
I mean, and you know, that's to say that I think, like, particularly if this ends up being a data point that we work on, which is the recommendation, I think we would imagine that future iterations of the survey, we would probably want to give a little more depth to areas that we're targeting. Whereas this time, we just wanted to keep it short enough that people would do it, you know, and so there's that magic, like, 3 to 4 minute window, and then people disengage. So I think that that's a thought for next time.
Totally. It's always balancing the needs of like wanting to understand a full universe of data versus really diving into very specific use cases. So I can
Can you
appreciate
say
that.
it one more time? It was like if it was school initiated.
Whether the IEP was initiated on behalf of the family or a social service agency versus whether the school initiated the conversation and had I proactively identified a concern or need.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think Ms. Powell, did you have something to add to that?
Just that, I just want to say, we did contemplate in early parts of this working group. And I know because I specifically brought up the question, and it was just very challenging for this iteration when we were trying to focus on this global idea of an audit and trying to get down to some of these strategic plan aligned audit questions, targeting that information, but it's definitely something the working group considered. And we know that it is something that's going to be a useful data point to see where we may be, as Ms. Misela said, might be missing some people or things fall through the cracks or how the process may be more onerous for parents or not. And so while we couldn't target it here, it has definitely been brought up and considered, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out as we get better at this, now that we've started, be able to figure out how to target that data better, because we do think that's going to be important for how we meet our students' needs and our, not just our students, but our families and our community's needs. So thank you for bringing that up.
I'm adding it to our ride questions.
I would like to just briefly address next steps. I mean, it seems to me we need to put together an RFP because I don't know, given the number of items, I assume that we're in the bidding threshold rather than in the competitive quote, because it's going to cost us more than $5,000.
That's probably-
So I'd like to, just so we're clear on some next steps, I mean, there'll be some other discussions.
Thought I kept it super cheap.
I guess, I guess you could go, but we could go back to David Sienka, we could go back to RIDE and say what parts of this, because RIDE, the audit that they do is not, it's a fine audit, but it's not particularly in-depth and like targeted to specific areas. I know that they indicated a willingness to do that, and I believe that. So I think, maybe the next step is the superintendent having a discussion with RIDE and with David Sienko and saying, this is what our survey showed and what our community is asking for. Is this something that you think that you can zero